David, the shepherd-turned-giant slayer, faced a new kind of giant, King Saul. Saul's jealousy of David's popularity festered into paranoia and then rage. He saw David as a threat, not a loyal subject.
I will not rest until David is no more. He is a danger to my throne.
Saul hunted David relentlessly, pushing him to the edge of his kingdom. David had to make a choice, fight back or flee. David chose flight. He knew that confronting Saul would mean civil war, dividing Israel and weakening it against its enemies. He couldn't bring himself to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed king.
I must go. I cannot fight Saul. It would tear Israel apart.
So, David, a man of deep faith, took a leap of faith. He sought refuge in the last place anyone expected, the land of the Philistines, Israel's sworn enemies. It was a desperate move, full of risk. David was gambling with his life and the lives of his loyal followers. He was entering the lion's den, hoping to find a way to survive until Saul's anger cooled or a new path opened up for him. David's escape marked a turning point in his life. He was no longer just a shepherd, a musician, or a warrior. He was now a fugitive, a leader on the run, forced to make impossible choices in the face of relentless danger. David and his 600 men, along with their families, journeyed to Gath, a Philistine city ruled by King Achish. They were a ragtag group, weary from their flight and uncertain of their future. They arrived at the gates of Gath not as conquerors but as supplicants, seeking sanctuary in the heart of enemy territory. The Philistines were wary. They knew David's reputation as a fierce warrior and giant slayer. They remembered his victory over Goliath, a humiliation that still stung. Allowing David and his men to remain in Philistine territory was a risk.
We come in peace, seeking refuge. I offer my loyalty to King Achish.
David, however, was a shrewd strategist. He presented himself not as a threat, but as a valuable asset. He pledged his loyalty to Achish, offering his services as a warrior in the Philistine army. He downplayed his connection to Israel, portraying himself as someone who had fallen out of favor with Saul.
David, the giant slayer, pledging loyalty to me? This could be interesting.
Achish, intrigued by the prospect of having David's military prowess on his side, decided to take a chance. He allowed David and his men to stay in Gath, but he kept a close eye on them, testing their loyalty and watching for any sign of treachery. Living in Gath, constantly under the suspicious gaze of the Philistines, was not a sustainable situation for David and his men. They yearned for a place of their own, a base of operations where they could regroup and plan for the future. David, sensing an opportunity, approached Achish with a request.
King Achish, grant us the city of Ziklag. It will serve as a buffer between you and your enemies.
He asked for a small, seemingly insignificant city named Ziklag, located on the outskirts of Philistine territory. David presented this as a gesture of loyalty, a way for him and his men to serve as a buffer between the Philistines and their enemies to the south.
Ziklag, you say? Very well, David, you may have it.
Achish, perhaps underestimating the strategic importance of Ziklag, granted David's request. The Philistine king likely saw this as a way to further bind David to him, believing that giving him a taste of power would ensure his allegiance. However, Achish's decision would have unintended consequences, for Ziklag would become more than just a refuge for David. It would become a launching pad for his future ambitions. Now established in Ziklag, David needed to provide for his men and maintain his image as a loyal vassal to Achish. He embarked on a series of raids against the Geshurites, Girzites and Amalekites, tribes living in the Negev desert south of Ziklag. These raids were swift and brutal, leaving no survivors to tell the tale. David's tactics were calculated. He chose his targets carefully, avoiding any attacks that would arouse the Philistines' suspicions or bring him into direct conflict with Saul.
We strike swiftly and leave no trace. Our survival depends on it.
These raids served a dual purpose. They provided David and his men with much-needed resources and plunder, ensuring their survival. More importantly, these raids solidified David's image in the eyes of the Philistines as a ruthless and effective warrior, further cementing their trust in him. These raids were not merely acts of survival, but calculated moves in a high-stakes game of power. David was laying the groundwork for his future. building his strength and his reputation while waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows. David understood the importance of maintaining the illusion of loyalty to Achish.
After each raid, I would present myself before the Philistine king, claiming that I had attacked Israelite settlements in the Negev.
He would bring back carefully selected plunder as proof of his attacks, further solidifying the deception. Achish, unaware of David's true actions, was pleased.
I see David's brutality as a sign of his commitment. By attacking his own people, he has severed any remaining ties to Israel and is now fully committed to the Philistine cause.
This web of lies, carefully woven and maintained, was essential for David's survival. He was walking a tightrope, balancing his desire for vengeance against Saul with the need to avoid any suspicion from the Philistines. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, could have shattered the fragile trust he had built and led to his downfall. The Philistines prepared for a major confrontation with the Israelites. Achish, confident in David's loyalty, summoned him and his men to join the Philistine army.
This presented me with a serious dilemma. Fighting alongside the Philistines against my own people was unthinkable, but refusing to fight would expose my deception and likely lead to my immediate execution.
As the Philistine army marched towards the valley of Elah, the other Philistine lords voiced their distrust of David, fearing he might turn against them in battle.
Though initially reluctant, I have no choice but to send David and his men back to Ziklag.
David's relief was short-lived. Upon returning to Ziklag, he found the city raided and burned, his families taken captive by the Amalekites. The very people he had spared in his deception had now struck at his most vulnerable point. This turn of events, although devastating, ultimately saved David from a far worse fate. Unbeknownst to David, his presence in Philistine territory had not gone unnoticed. Rumors of his exploits reached Saul, fueling his paranoia and suspicion.
How could David, a man after God's own heart, ally himself with the enemies of Israel?
While Saul remained convinced of David's treachery, the fact that David was living among the Philistines raised doubts in the minds of some Israelites. They questioned how David could ally himself with the enemies of Israel. These doubts, whispered in hushed tones, planted seeds of distrust towards David among Saul's followers. This suspicion would cast a long shadow over David's reign, even after he became king. David's time among the Philistines was a period of extreme moral ambiguity. He was forced to make difficult choices, often compromising his own values to survive.
I lied, I deceived, and I shed blood, all while maintaining a facade of loyalty to my enemies.
This calculated risk, while ultimately ensuring his survival, would have lasting consequences. It showed him the ruthlessness of power, the lengths to which people would go to preserve it. It exposed him to the dark side of leadership, the difficult choices and compromises that came with it. These experiences, though painful, would shape David into the king he would become. A king who understood both the burdens and the temptations of power. The 18 months David spent among the Philistines were a pivotal period in his life. It was a time of testing, of growth, and of profound transformation.
I entered Philistine territory as a fugitive, hunted by my own king, but I emerged as a seasoned leader, a cunning strategist, and a hardened warrior.
He had faced death countless times, stared into the abyss of despair, and made unimaginable choices to survive. He had learned to trust his instincts, to rely on his men, and to never underestimate the cunning of his enemies. This period of exile, though fraught with danger and compromise, forged David into the leader he was destined to become. His cunning and strategic brilliance, honed in the crucible of Philistine intrigue, would enable him to unite the 12 tribes of Israel and establish a powerful kingdom. Yet, the shadows of his time in exile, the compromises he made, and the deceptions he perpetrated would continue to haunt him, reminding him of the price of power and the burden of leadership. The story of David among the Philistines serves as a powerful reminder that even the greatest heroes are flawed, that even the most righteous individuals are capable of making difficult choices in the face of extraordinary circumstances. It is a story of survival, of resilience, and ultimately of redemption as David, despite the darkness he encountered, emerged stronger and ready to fulfill his destiny as King of Israel. S1 Media. David emerging victorious in battle, scenes of ancient resilience, David crowned as King of Israel. The lessons I learned, the alliances I forged, and the enemies I made during this time would shape my reign as king. Narrator. Media. David, forging alliances with Philistines, scenes of ancient alliances, David with Philistine soldiers. David's time among the Philistines left an indelible mark on his life and legacy. It was a period of intense moral and physical challenges, forcing him to confront his own vulnerabilities and make difficult choices.